Welcome, Chris Sabatini.
Thanks, Moises.
What is social inclusion?
It's the idea that goes beyond economic inequality to talk about rights and access to public and private goods like education, adequate housing, health care, and also the responsibility of the government to provide for its people.
How is that different from measuring poverty?
Well, one thing is the idea that there are civil and political rights which are part of a broader notion of citizenship that go beyond just the economic status or the differences between the rich and the poor, that are sort of political responsibilities of a government to provide. And also it's about the access to those things irrespective of gender or race or ethnicity, and the absence of discrimination and the participation of people in their political and civil rights. So it's much broader in terms of, it has to do with citizenship, and it has to do with politics and civil rights and lack of discrimination.
Give me an example of excluded people.
Well, of course, the classic example would be many indigenous in Latin America. And we see this in some of the studies we've been doing. If you look at in levels of access to education and levels in people living in poverty, throughout Latin America, indigenous are overwhelmingly represent the poor and the excluded in many of these societies.
So your magazine, America's Quarterly, did a study. You led a team that identified this in different countries. How did that index, and you created an index of inclusion. How does that work?
Well, the first goal was to try to define it. Social inclusion now is used by everyone. And President Obama used it, multilateral banks use it, President Humala of Peru sort of campaigned on it in the election to presidency. So first we wanted to define, what is this? And what we decided was it's a number of things. First of all, economic growth. You can't redistribute wealth if you're not growing. Second is the idea of spending on social programs. And the other is the idea of political and civil rights and access to private goods. So what we did was we developed measures for each of those that allowed us to look at individual countries and compare them across the region.
So you did all these studies, you included all the numbers. What are the results? Which are the countries that are the best in Latin America because they have the least exclusion?
Two countries come out on top, Chile and Uruguay, in that order. And on a scale of 0 to 100, Chile scored 71.9 and Uruguay 71.2. Far below that was Brazil at 50, which was third, but a distant third.
So the first is Chile, the second is Uruguay, and the third is Brazil at a very lower level.
Yes.
The surprise, of course, is that Chile is a very unequal country and Brazil is very unequal. How can you be unequal and very unequal and at the same time have a very high ranking in terms of your social inclusion?
Well, that's what makes this interesting, because we have 15 different variables that include everything from politics to economics to access to public goods. So while Chile is very weak in some areas, the differences by race, for example, or ethnicity are much different, or much less than in Brazil, where, for example, there's a 7% difference in girls' access to secondary education in Brazil, which doesn't exist in Chile. They're almost at parity.
What are the worst countries?
Easily Nicaragua and Guatemala, and for a number of reasons. First of all, Guatemala and Nicaragua have some of the lowest levels of the percent of the economy spent in social programs, but also
so the government doesn't spend in trying to create inclusion.
Exactly. So the inputs to social inclusion aren't even strong. But then if you look at the outputs in terms of access to education, percent living on more than $4 a day, the classic example of being above poverty, there are huge discrepancies by race and by gender in all of those. So not only are these countries poor, within their populations there are large levels of questions about access and opportunity that are determined by who you are and where you live. And that, in many ways, is a definition of social inclusion.
One of the very interesting findings of your research that is a surprise is that the United States, this giant country, spends less in trying to promote social inclusions than countries like Uruguay or Brazil.
Yeah, and it demonstrates that in the results as well. And there are some very troubling results for the United States. Brazil is one of the leaders in terms of spending on its population, and it shows. If you look at the percent of people that have access to housing, the percent of people who are living on more than $4 per day, Brazil ranks very high. In the United States, it may do on those, but sense of sort of political engagement of Americans, their sense of the responsiveness and their trust in their government is very, very low. And I think we see that recently in the news with the Occupy Wall Street movement and certainly with the polarization in the U.S. electorate. And so we're coming to a point where I think the United States, given increasing inequalities, needs to decide whether it wants to increase those social expenditures to be able to address these concerns.
In your study, you have all the countries in the hemisphere except two. What are the two?
The two are Argentina and Venezuela. And why? It's because we didn't have confidence in the numbers. Most of the numbers that we used, about 4 of them, were based on household surveys that were conducted by the governments in each country that we then disaggregated, pulled apart, by race and by gender. We didn't trust the numbers that the governments were giving us from Argentina and Venezuela. And here's the irony. Those two governments, their most claim to fame and popularity is they're working on social inclusion. And yet, they can't even provide numbers to demonstrate whether they're doing it.
What would be your advice to a government that tells you, I want to fight exclusion? If President Humala, as you said, he ran on the platform of promising that he was going to fight the exclusion that is so pervasive in Peru, what would you advise him to do?
Well, Peru is a good case because in the index, Peru is the leader in the hemisphere in terms of economic growth over the last 10 years. But it's the 3rd lowest in terms of percent of the economy spent on social programs. So the first thing is increase social investment. The second is, if you look in the case of Peru, is ensuring better and more equal access by race and gender. If you look across the inputs, education and investment, the outputs as well, housing and health and others, the discrepancy by race, which is to say indigenous and non-indigenous, is huge, and it's one of the largest in the hemisphere. So there has to be assurances and guarantees that the indigenous and the rural in Peru, but throughout, particularly in Peru, need to have better and more equal access to a lot of these public goods.
One final question, Dr. Sabatini. Given the current trends, given what's happening now in Latin America that you have studied, if the trends continue in 10 years, will Latin America be better or worse than it is today in terms of inclusion?
I think it will be more diverse. That is to say, if you look at these numbers, you can see that some countries are on a different trajectory. Countries like Mexico are doing very well. They're hampered in terms of the measures of economic growth, primarily tied to the 2007 collapse, but they're doing far better in terms of access to education, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of access to adequate housing. The one thing that they're weak on is access to formal jobs, which is something that is not surprising. Brazil is doing very well on a number. Chile has to catch up in some areas, but is doing very, very well. And then you look at the others. You look at cases like Ecuador. You look at cases like Guatemala. You look at cases like Nicaragua. What you really see are a number of a very divergent region that's going to go in different paths. And in that is the United States. I think that we'll have to see which path it takes. And it goes back to your earlier question. Can the United States step up and address levels of public dissatisfaction and growing levels of inequality through its own social programs? We'll see where it ends.
We will see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moises.